When was the last time you really focused on a task? When you weren't multitasking, stopping every few minutes to follow up on an email, Slack notification, or check your phone? When was the last time you tackled a really hairy problem and just sat down and powered through it for an hour or two without giving yourself social media breaks, putting on YouTube videos or podcasts in the background, or looking for excuses to work on something else? When was the last time you sat down to work on a creative project, like drafting a manuscript, and just wrote for a solid hour instead of convincing yourself that you needed to clean the house, do your laundry, and call your grandma first? For most of us, focused work is a foreign concept. It feels genuinely uncomfortable. Even as I sat down to write this script and stared at the blinking cursor on the blank page, I found myself opening a new tab and navigating to Twitter before I even realized what I was doing. When I came back to the dock and forced myself to stay in this tab and only this tab, I started bouncing my leg and fidgeting with the bracelet I was wearing because my mind wanted to do anything but focus on the singular task at hand. What's truly remarkable about acknowledging that is that I wanted to write this script. I didn't particularly want to check Twitter or waste time scrolling on social media. What I wanted to do was write. But deep work is hard. It's taxing. Our brains aren't inclined toward deep focus work by default, and our current technological environments mean that shallowness and dopamine hits are always a few keystrokes away. Additionally, think about how most of us have to work and the habits we've created for ourselves. I'm going on nearly a decade in the tech industry. Even when I block off the first 2 hours of my day for focus time, I'm still consistently interrupted by urgent Slack messages when someone has a go to market question, or there are emails from our leadership team, and so on. Without really thinking about it, I've learned that being on my computer or my phone means I'm available and I'm reactive to incoming messages and alerts and dings as they arrive. Goodbye, impulse control. As you may be starting to see, there's an internal tug of war most of us face between wanting to stay focused on meaningful work and having our attention diverted elsewhere. In the corporate world, we've learned to make do and produce adequate results in spite of our nearly constant interruptions. But I think the book I'm talking about today would agree that we're doing ourselves a disservice by continuing to work, think, and live in this way. There's a richness and depth, not only to our quality of work, but also to our inner quality of life, which, by the way, is far more important than our capitalist outputs, when we aren't intentional about creating space where we can go deep. So, let's dive in and sink our teeth into Cal Newport's deep work. Newport splits deep work into two parts. In the first part, the idea, he explores what deep work is and what it contributes to those who practice it. In the second part, the rules, he outlines what he sees as the core steps one needs to take or work toward in order to work deeply. Before we dive too deep into part one, though, let's start with the definition of deep work. In the introduction of the book, Newport defines deep work as professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive capabilities to their limit. These efforts create new value, improve your skill, and are hard to replicate. He then goes on to say that deep work is necessary to wring every last drop of value out of your current intellectual capacity. We now know from decades of research in both psychology and neuroscience that the state of mental strain that accompanies deep work is also necessary to improve your abilities. Compare what Newport describes in the definition of deep work to some examples I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Rather than thinking about work as something we do in a state of concerted focus, we think about it as something that exists temporarily between interruptions. Working between interruptions or juggling multiple tasks and types of disruptions at once doesn't allow us the mental bandwidth to think deeply and push past the limits of our cognitive capabilities. To put it in simpler language, even if we have the potential to do something at an A plus level, we end up not giving ourselves the opportunity to really go beyond a C minus level. Still in the introduction of deep work, Newport compares deep work to its inverse, which he aptly names shallow work. Shallow work is defined as non cognitively demanding, logistical style tasks often performed while distracted. These efforts tend to not create much new value in the world and are easy to replicate. Throughout the course of the book, he uses shallow work and deep work to paint a picture of a declining state for knowledge workers, particularly in the United States, offering a critique of how corporate culture, economic demands, and technologies have been damaging for workers and the quality of goods and services produced across the board. This is a fairly long quote, but I think it's important context for much of the rest of the book. Newport writes, the reason knowledge workers are losing their familiarity with deep work is well established. Network tools. This is a broad category that captures communication services like email and SMS, social media networks like Twitter and Facebook, and the shiny tangle of infotainment sites like BuzzFeed and Reddit. In aggregate, the rise of these tools, combined with ubiquitous access to them through smartphones and networked office computers, has fragmented most knowledge workers' attention into slivers. A 2012 McKinsey study found that the average knowledge worker now spends more than 60% of the work week engaged in electronic communication and internet searching, with close to 30% of a worker's time dedicated to reading and answering email alone. This state of fragmented attention cannot accommodate deep work, which requires long periods of uninterrupted thinking. At the same time, however, modern knowledge workers are not loafing. In fact, they report that they are as busy as ever. What explains this discrepancy? A lot can be explained by another type of effort, which provides a counterpart to the idea of deep work, shallow work. In the age of network tools, in other words, knowledge workers increasingly replace deep work with the shallow alternative, constantly sending and receiving email messages like human network routers, with frequent breaks for quick hits of distraction. Larger efforts that would be well served by deep thinking, such as forming a new business strategy or writing an important grant application, get fragmented into distracted dashes that produce muted quality. While Newport speaks specifically about knowledge workers in corporate and academic environments throughout his book, it's important to call out that the same can be said of artists, especially writers, who often are seated at computers while trying to engage in their craft. For me, one of my biggest challenges as a writer is dealing with the constant influx of distractions that comes in while I'm trying to write, combined with the allure of easy dopamine hits that I can reach for when writing gets tough. And writing is always tough. That said, what Newport paints in the introduction of the book is a pretty grim picture of the modern workplace. And if you've worked in a corporate environment for very long, you may have accepted that that's just the way things are. Sure, it may not be work that you're proud of or which you find cognitively demanding, but does it need to be cognitively demanding if you're still getting your paycheck all the same? Well, let's do a quick overview of part one of deep work. Newport breaks part one, the idea, into three chapters. Deep work is valuable, deep work is rare, and deep work is meaningful. In exploring the value of deep work, there are a few outcomes that he focuses on specifically. Namely, that deep work helps you quickly learn hard things, and deep work helps you produce at an elite level. Newport describes these two attributes as the combined keys to becoming a winner in the new economy. When he talks about deep work being valuable, he literally means in the economic sense of the word. By being able to acquire new skills and learn difficult concepts quickly, and then combining that with a high level of output, you make yourself a standout candidate in most fields where expertise is more valuable than generic surface level skills. Remember, one of the hallmarks of deep work is that it's difficult to replicate, whereas shallow work's outputs are easy to replicate. Based on what we've gone over so far, the second idea of deep work should be fairly straightforward, and that is that deep work is rare. As we've outlined, most corporate environments push workers toward the path of least resistance, and we're practically trained to think of busyness as a proxy for productivity. Plenty of people have very full calendars and are always doing something, but producing very little meaningful output. This makes deep work a rarity, so we can apply some principles of economics to it. It's in low supply but high demand, which I would argue goes back to increasing its value. Finally, in the third chapter of part 1, Newport makes the case that deep work is meaningful. Here, he turns to the fields of psychology and philosophy to make a case for depth. To vastly oversimplify this chapter, he explores the ways in which people find meaning and fulfillment in their work. Citing the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi on flow, he writes, "The connection between deep work and flow should be clear. Deep work is an activity well suited to generate a flow state." The phrase used by Csikszentmihalyi to describe what generates flow include notions of stretching your mind to its limits, concentrating, and losing yourself in an activity, all of which also describe deep work. And as we just learned, flow generates happiness. Combining these two ideas, we get a powerful argument from psychology in favor of depth. The chapter then goes on to unpack philosophical ideas of sacredness and meaning, and how the traditions of craftsmen, with a focus on skill development and quality work, led to greater quality of life than our current paradigm of knowledge work, and how deep work is more aligned with the craftsman mentality. As we wrap up the first half of the book, it's important to call out that Deep Work was originally published in 2016. That's about 7 years before OpenAI's flagship product, ChatGPT, burst onto the scene. In light of the current surge in ML products, I think Newport's claims of deep work's value and rarity become even stronger. Remember, one of the hallmarks of shallow work is that it is easily replicated. With some basic programming skills and a few software subscriptions, now you can basically automate the majority of your shallow work. It does a pretty mediocre job, but that's what's so frustrating and mind-numbing about shallow work. It bends you toward mediocrity. I think as LLM-backed tools make it easier for more and more people to work on the same median level in more areas of the corporate sector, knowledge work, it's only going to get harder to stand out and have the opportunity to do truly meaningful, impactful work. People who can focus, think deeply, and push the boundaries of their cognitive abilities are going to be the ones who can stand out and genuinely create a legacy for themselves as the knowledge economy undergoes the next phase of its evolution. Deep work is pretty great, but how do you actually achieve it? In my own experience, it takes a ton of practice. I like to go to a public space where others can see my screen, get a coffee, put on noise canceling headphones, turn on white noise or binaural soundscapes, activate an app like Self Control that enforces a website block list on my computer, put my phone on Do Not Disturb, journal about my clearly and narrowly defined goals for my deep work session for the day, and then begin. That's what works for me most of the time. And it's a ritual largely inspired by what I learned from reading this book. As you can probably guess, Newport breaks down the rules of deep work a little bit differently. It's not as formulaic as what I do. He constructs the rules as 4 different chapters and presents them as: Rule number 1, work deeply. Rule number 2, embrace boredom. Rule number 3, quit social media. Rule number 4, drain the shallows. I'll critique the writing of the book at the end of the review, but I promise Newport is a better writer than the rule title Work Deeply for a section on how to achieve deep work would suggest. Newport explores the concept of willpower for this rule first. Specifically, he's honing in on the idea that you have a finite amount of willpower that becomes depleted as you use it. So by saying that the first rule of deep work is to work deeply, he's essentially saying that you shouldn't expend your limited willpower on non-deep work when deep work is your priority. With this in mind, he then uses the chapter on working deeply as a means of deep work to cover 6 strategies for boosting, conserving, and focusing your willpower for what matters most. Deciding on your depth philosophy, for example, will you block off an hour and a half each day, 1 whole day per week, 4 hours, 2 days per week, and so on. Ritualize. Decide where you'll work and for how long, how you'll work once you start to work, and how you'll support your work. Make grand gestures. Don't work alone. Execute like a business by focusing on the wildly important aspects, acting on the lead measures, keeping a compelling scoreboard, and creating a cadence of accountability. Be lazy. While it sounds contradictory, this strategy is about injecting regular and substantial freedom from professional concerns into your day, providing you with the idleness paradoxically required to get deep work done. The second rule, embrace boredom, is one of the hardest for me. I have a hard time sitting still and feeling like I'm not being productive. With this rule, though, what Newport describes is essentially a meditative or mindfulness practice. He writes, efforts to deepen your focus will struggle if you don't simultaneously wean your mind from a dependence on distraction. Much in the same way that athletes must take care of their bodies outside of training sessions, you'll struggle to achieve the deepest levels of concentration if you spend the rest of your time fleeing the slightest hint of boredom. That one hit home for me. On autopilot, I'll play YouTube videos in the background while doing housework or answering emails, almost as if I don't want to be alone with the quiet of my mind. This then bleeds into my habits when I'm trying to perform deep work. The autopilot kicks in, I start scrolling mindlessly, and my willpower and energy are gone before I've done a tenth of what I wanted to do. Rule 3 is quit social media. This one is the most straightforward on the surface, though I acknowledge it's not always the simplest in practice. Some of us have to be on social media to some degree for our jobs, but that doesn't mean that these networks don't do more harm than good. In this section, Newport outlines a variety of approaches and strategies one can take, but the part that resonated with me the most was when he discusses the craftsman approach to tool selection. Again, he evokes the craftsman as a means of comparing today's situation to that of the past. Here, he writes, I propose that if you're a knowledge worker, especially one interested in cultivating a deep work habit, you should treat your tool selection with the same level of care as other skilled workers, such as farmers. Following is my attempt to generalize this assessment strategy. I call it the craftsman approach to tool selection, a name that emphasizes that tools are ultimately aids to the larger goals of one's craft. The craftsman approach to tool selection. Identify the core factors that determine success and happiness in your professional and personal life. Adopt a tool only if its positive impacts on these factors substantially outweigh its negative impacts. In the final rule and chapter of the book, Newport advocates for draining the shallows. That is, creating boundaries that healthfully enforce limits on the amount of shallow work that is expected of you and which you expect of yourself. Here, he proposes time boxing your schedule so that you can visualize how you're allocating your time and see what you're actually putting your time and energy into. And other tactics like working with your boss to define a shallow work budget in which you articulate what the expectations are of you to do things like answering emails and other shallow administrative duties versus those tasks that are more meaningful and impactful for your business or organization. The goal of this rule, essentially, is to trim the fat. It acknowledges that shallow work is such a ubiquitous part of the modern work experience that we're expected to perform it, and that we can't escape the trappings of it until we draw lines around it and create space in our schedules for deep work, get vertical alignment with our managers about how we should be really using our time. Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World is a must read, in my opinion, for anyone working what would be considered a knowledge job. So that would be folks in the corporate or nonprofit environments, academic environments, and creative fields. The value of deep work that Newport describes has only increased since the AI and ML tool boom, and I think his strategies for how we can create systems of deep work really hold up if they are accessible to you. And that is a big if. One critique I would offer, though I'm not sure if it's directly a critique of the book or of the modern economy, is that some of the rules, especially things like draining the shallows and some of the tactics within work deeply, assume a certain degree of privilege and autonomy that isn't always afforded to entry level workers who would arguably most benefit from having the opportunity to engage in deep work. And a lot of the shallow work we're trying to avoid ends up getting offloaded onto entry level folks who are also underpaid and unable to afford things like grand gestures to spark their deep work. So I think additional strategies there may be warranted to further investigate how folks in roles where shallow work is more inescapable can still create more space for deep work. That said, this is one of my favorite books that I've read in the last few years, and I wish I would have read it sooner. Newport is one of my favorite writers because his writing style is inclined toward applicability and is very information dense without reading like academic writing. One of the hallmarks of a good writer is that they make difficult concepts easy to understand. Writing that is easy to read is really hard to write. I will say that I think there are parts of the book toward the end that drag on a little bit too long, but not to the extent that it distracted or detracted from my experience. One of our core values at Howdy Curiosity is that we believe it's possible for people to balance their careers with the things that bring them a sense of fulfillment and accomplishment. And the concepts explored within Deep Work fit really well within that paradigm. I see the engaging in deep work as one of the more meaningful ways that you, as an independent creator or entrepreneur, can maximize your limited free time, explore what matters most, and figure out how to create the most rewarding and meaningful and impactful systems for yourself. So, on that count, this book ranks incredibly highly on my recommendation list. Anyways, it's time for me and my dog to go for a walk. So I'm going to go do that. Then I'm going to go get back to some more of my own deep work. If you've liked this book review, give us a like and subscribe so that we'll keep making more. And if you want to check out deep work for yourself, you can head over to our website at shop.howdycuriosity.com and use the code YouTube5 for 5% off any purchase at checkout. All right. See you next time, folks.